The Gulf War. We're reading from Media Control by Noam Chomsky. The Gulf War. That tells you how a well functioning propaganda system works. People can believe that when we use force against Iraq and Kuwait, it's because we really observe the principle that illegal occupation and human rights abuses should be met by force. They don't see what it would mean if those principles were applied to US behavior. That's the success of propaganda of quite a spectacular way. Spectacular type. That's the success of propaganda of quite a spectacular type. Let's take a look at another case. If you look closely at the coverage of war since August 1990, you will notice that there are a couple of striking voices missing. For example, there is an Iraqi democratic opposition, in fact, a very courageous and quite substantial Iraqi democratic opposition. They, of course, function in exile because they couldn't survive in Iraq. They are in Europe primarily. They are bankers, engineers, architects, people like that. They are articulate, they have voices, and they speak. The previous February, when Saddam Hussein was still George Bush's favorite friend and trading partner, they actually came to Washington, according to Iraqi democratic opposition sources, with a plea for some kind of support for a demand of their calling for a parliamentary democracy in Iraq. They were totally rebuffed because the United States had no interest in it. There was no reaction to this in the public record. Since August, it became a little harder to ignore their existence. In August, we suddenly turned against Saddam Hussein after having favored him for many years. Here was an Iraqi democratic opposition who ought to have some thoughts about the matter. They would be happy to see Saddam Hussein drawn and quartered. He killed their brothers, tortured their sisters, and drove them out of the country. They have been fighting against this tyranny throughout the whole time that Ronald Reagan and George Bush were cherishing him. What about their voices? Take a look at the national media and see how much you can find about the Iraqi democratic opposition from August through March 1991. You can't find a word. It's not that they are inarticulate. They have statements, proposals, calls, and demands. If you look at them, you find that they are indistinguishable from those of the American peace movement. They are against Saddam Hussein and they are against the war against Iraq. They don't want their country destroyed. They are against Saddam Hussein and they are against the war against Iraq. They don't want their country destroyed. What they want is a peaceful resolution, and they knew perfectly well that it might have been achievable. That's the wrong view, and therefore they are out. We don't hear a word about the Iraqi democratic opposition. If you want to find out about them, pick up the German press or British press. They don't say much about them, but they are less controlled than we are, and they say something. This is a spectacular achievement of propaganda. First, that the voices of the Iraqi Democrats are completely excluded, and second, that nobody notices it. That's interesting too. It takes a really deeply indoctrinated population not to notice that we are not hearing the voices of the Iraqi democratic opposition and not asking the question, why? And finding out the obvious answer, because the Iraqi Democrats have their own thoughts. They agree with the international peace movement and therefore they are out. Let's take the question of the reasons for the war. Reasons were offered for the war. The reasons are: aggressors cannot be rewarded and aggression must be reversed by the quick resort to violence. That was the reason for the war. There was basically no other reason advanced. Can that possibly be the reason for the war? Does the United States uphold those principles that aggressors cannot be rewarded and that aggression must be reversed by a quick resort to violence? I won't insult your intelligence by running through the facts, but the fact is, those arguments could be refuted in 2 minutes by a literate teenager. However, They never were refuted. Take a look at the media, the liberal commentators and critics, the people who testified in Congress, and see whether anybody questioned the assumption that the United States stands up to those principles. Has the United States opposed its own aggression in Panama and insisted on bombing Washington to reverse it? When the South African occupation of Namibia was declared illegal in 1969, did the United States impose sanctions on food and medicine? Did it go to war? Did it bomb Cape Town? No, it carried out 20 years of quiet diplomacy. It wasn't very pretty during those 20 years. In the years of the Reagan Bush administration alone, about 1.5 million people were killed by South Africa just in the surrounding countries. Forget what was happening in South Africa and Namibia. Somehow we didn't hear our sensitive soul. We continued with quiet diplomacy and ended up with ample reward for the aggressors. They were given the major port in Namibia and plenty of advantages that took into account their security concerns. Where is this principle that we uphold? Again, it's child's play to demonstrate that those couldn't possibly have been the reasons for going to war because we don't uphold these principles. But nobody did it. That's what's important. And nobody bothered to point out the conclusion that follows. No reason was given for going to war. None. No reason was given for going to war that could not be refuted by a literate teenager in about 2 minutes. That again is the hallmark of a totalitarian culture. It ought to frighten us that we are so deeply totalitarian that we can be driven to war without any reason being given for it and without anybody noticing Lebanon's request to carry. It's a very striking fact. Right before the bombing started in mid January, the major Washington Post ABC poll revealed something interesting. People were asked if Iraq would agree to withdraw from Kuwait in return for Security Council consideration of problem of Arab-Israeli conflict. Would you be in favor of that? By about two-tone, the population was in favor of that. By about two-thirds, the population was in favor of that. So was the whole world, including the Iraqi democratic opposition. So was the whole world, including Iraqi democratic opposition. So it was reported that two-thirds of the American population were in favor of that. Presumably, the people who were in favor of that thought, they were the only ones in the world to think so. Certainly, nobody in the press had said that it would be a good idea. The orders from Washington have been we are supposed to be against linkage, that is diplomacy, and therefore everybody on command, and everybody was go and see strict commands, and everybody was against diplomacy.